Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to look at this multiple choice question here, which says in the pedigree chart, individuals affected by a genetic disease are shown as shaded symbols. Squares like these represent males and circles represent females. So here this square that is shaded would represent a diseased male. And this circle here that's not shaded would represent a female that is not affected by the disease. We are told that it is a genetic disease. What you must do is to determine what is the mode of inheritance of this genetic disease. And you've got these four choices to go with. Students would have different ways of arriving at this answer. Some may include methods that don't have any set reasoning, but it would arrive at the correct answer. For instance, there is no mention in the biology guide of sex-linked dominant genetic diseases. So therefore, how could that possibly be the answer? That kind of reasoning is not the reasoning that we want to use. Another more acceptable type of reasoning is to say that this disease doesn't appear to occur more in males than in females. There are 6 affected people, 2 of which are males, 4 of which are females. So that's not the usual pattern for something that is linked to the X chromosome of a male. Like here, for instance, a male that is affected by color blindness would just need one allele to be affected. That, however, is not conclusive proof. With just a small sample set like this, it's not conclusive proof. So what we're going to do now is to prove conclusively what the answer is to this question. And what we need to do is to focus on this particular area here of this pedigree chart. As we go into it, let's review what do we mean by the term sex-linked in this IB biology guide. Well, you should recall that the male is the heterogametic sex, meaning that the Y chromosome much smaller in size than the X. So for this corresponding part here of the X chromosome, for which there's no corresponding part on the Y, alleles that are carried here are only present as single alleles in males. And it so happens that the allele that determines whether an individual is colorblind or not is carried in this part. So a man, for him to be colorblind, all he needs is the recessive allele to be carried on his X chromosome. He doesn't have any option of having anything on the Y because the Y is such a small chromosome. But females, on the other hand, they can be described as carriers when they are heterozygous, like this. So what is the explanation for this type of inheritance? Could it possibly be that we have an X-linked recessive condition like hemophilia or like red-green color blindness? Well, focusing on that highlighted area here and bringing it out into this diagram, this affected male here would have to be given this genotype if we're talking about him being a colorblind male. And following the fact that this female is also colorblind, if it is that this is a sex-linked recessive condition, this would be her genotype. Then you have to look at this female here who is not colorblind. That would not be possible. There's no way that they would have a daughter who is not colorblind, because the male would always be passing on this recessive allele and the female is passing on what she has, which is the same recessive alleles. So the fact that they have a daughter who is not colorblind means that X-linked recessive is not an option. Next, we consider the option of X-linked dominant. Now that's not even mentioned on the IB biology guide, but what would it mean if it exists? Well, it means that a single dominant allele is present here on a male, making him have this X-linked dominant trait, which we'll just call B, big B here. For a female to be affected, all she would need is one single big B. It doesn't matter what she's got here. She'll be affected. It won't be you won't have a carrier in this case because there's nothing on this X chromosome. So you won't have a carrier. Now, if the female carries this and the male carries that, and again you have a daughter who is not affected, that would not be possible because here we're talking about a dominant, and the male is bound to pass this X on if he's having a daughter. So therefore, once there's a dominant X-linked trait, it means that this offspring here must be affected by this disease, whatever that dominant sex-linked disease is, which we don't have any mentioned in the biology guide. So that too is out of the question. Now let's look at the option of autosomal recessive. Autosomes now refer to the fact that males and females both have a pair of alleles. The XY linkage situation doesn't come in here. So autosomal recessive, and with both parents here suffering from whatever that autosomal recessive condition is, for instance, an example in our syllabus is cystic fibrosis. If both individuals have cystic fibrosis, it means they're both homozygous recessive, like these two genotypes here suggest. And again, this individual would not be possible. All of their offspring would have to be the same genotype, homozygous recessive. So autosomal recessive is also rejected as a possible answer, leaving us with one choice, which is autosomal dominant. But we don't want to arrive at the answer simply by elimination. We want to arrive at the answer by conclusive evidence. So autosomal dominant refers to a big, let's say letter A, doesn't matter what you have here, the individual will have the condition. Another big dominant letter here, doesn't matter what you have here. So assuming that both of these individuals are heterozygous, which they could be if it's autosomal dominant, they each carry one dominant allele that gives the condition, then if they're heterozygous, and they could be, it is possible for them to have a daughter that is unaffected by this autosomal dominant condition. An example of such an autosomal dominant condition in the guide is Huntington's disease. So it is possible for two individuals who both have Huntington's disease to have a child that does not have the disease. As you could see here, the chance of that happening is 25%. Huntington's, of course, appears later on in life, and it's quite possible that this kind of scenario could happen as people with Huntington's don't realize that until they are well past their childbearing years. So therefore, it's quite possible that two individuals, both who are suffering from Huntington's, would have one or several children, and there's a 25% chance that their children will not have Huntington's disease. And this pedigree chart that we are given here, the answer to this question is A, that what's shown here is providing evidence that this disease is inherited as a dominant autosomal allele. And an example of such a dominant autosomal allele is Huntington's disease.